Good morning, C2 Church. Buenos dias, iglesia. Someone just called me by, that's the name my mama calls me when no, I'm playing. Actually, everyone in my family, I feel like, calls me Ben for the most part, except for my little brother, Otto. He called me Benjamin the most, I think, which I love. So that was fun. Thanks, Reese. It is good to see you this morning. Buenos dias. I might jump in back and forth a little bit between English and Spanish this morning. Just a quick plug for everyone here, in case I haven't met you yet, and you do speak Spanish as a second language or a first language. We are getting ready to, we're working on developing simultaneous translation of our services actually into Spanish. Yeah, really, really fun. It's been a long time coming. We've been praying through it. So we're kind of forming a team of people to help with that and to participate. And so if you're interested at all in learning Spanish or you know Spanish and you're interested in being a part of that, helping in any way at all, we'd love to have you come see me after service and we'll get you plugged into what God's doing there. Yeah, really, really fun. Who knows what other languages might follow in the future. That would be really fun, wouldn't it? We are, I'm so excited. We're in a series called Reconstructing Jesus. And if you haven't been with us, this is your first time, you're kind of coming in the middle. So I would say it's going to hopefully make sense. I always try to put that out there at the beginning. Hopefully, I think it's going to make sense. I am the one speaking, so high probability that it won't. But if you're confused or if you kind of want to get backstory and context on what we've been talking about, I would strongly encourage you to listen to go to YouTube and check out our channel on YouTube, C2 Church. It has like our sermon library just to catch up the message that Pastor Jeremy gave last week and the week before even. I mean, just powerful and really great work on like, let's get back to the Jesus of Scripture and let's go ahead and allow maybe the things that our culture has taught us about him to fall by the wayside. And let's encounter him for ourselves. And so just want to really encourage you to do that. But came across a story recently that was, I think was like kind of a pop culture conversation online. I'm not online a whole lot, so I kind of just came by it. But there was a professor at Princeton who asked his students a question. I'm really curious. I'm really interested about this because I just started teaching a high school class this year, just one. And it's like, way more than I thought I could handle, right? And so I really have an appreciation for teachers and people in education at any level, whether it's all the way from preschool through college, university, and especially moms and dads. It's a big, really huge, important role. So I just want to say thank you to all of you who are involved in that in some way, who get to kind of touch those areas and be involved in the raising up of the next generation. Really, really amazing. Thank you for your work. But this particular professor, I think his name is Robert George at Princeton, and the story came out through Twitter for the most part, back when it was called Twitter. And he, we can throw that first one up there. He asked his class a question and challenged them with a question. It was a phenomenal question. He said this. He said, I sometimes ask students what their position on slavery would have been had they been white and living in the South before abolition. So before the Civil War, before the abolition of slavery and kind of all these things took place, that time period, white Americans, what would have been their position? He says, guess what? They would have all been abolitionists. They all would have bravely spoken out against slavery and worked tirelessly against it. He followed this up with a challenge, and he says this in the next slide there. Of course, this is nonsense. Only the tiniest fraction of them or any of us would have spoken up against slavery or lifted a finger to free the slaves. Most of them and us would have gone along. Many would have supported the slave system and happily benefited from it. Let's go to the next slide. So I responded by saying that I will credit their claims. It's valid. You can say you raise your hand and it's valid if they can show evidence of the following: that in leading their lives today, they have stood up for the rights of unpopular victims of injustice, whose very humanity is denied. And where they have done so, aware that it would make them unpopular with their peers, that they would be loathed and ridiculed by powerful, influential individuals and institutions in our society, that they would be abandoned by many of their friends, that they would be called nasty names, and that they would risk being denied valuable professional opportunities as a result of their moral witness. In short, my challenge is to show where they have, at risk to themselves and their futures, stood up for a cause that is unpopular in elite sectors of our culture today. Phenomenal question. And wherever your personal response is to this, I immediately began to think about myself and my own life, and I kind of was wrestling with this. And whatever that response looks like doesn't really matter a whole lot. The point is that this question is a really insightful and thoughtful look at the way we are, right? Like, how do we, sitting in the place where we are right now, how do we know that we are any better? We have this idea of progression in our culture and society. How do we know that we're actually really better than the generations that came before us? How do we know that we're not just making the same mistakes with different names? Right? How can we be aware of that, especially as it relates to Jesus and the scriptures? How can we know that the way we understand Jesus and the way that we are living him out and the way we talk about him, how can we know that that's not just a product of the way that we've been taught, of the mistakes about Jesus that our ancestors made? The realities that the way of thinking about church or the way of thinking about belief and faith, how do we know? How do we know, right? This is a phenomenal question, because many of us, to some degree, and there might be differing views on this, but many of us would probably admit that in many ways we are a product of the culture that we live within, right? None of us, and again, it's in varying degrees, but many of us sitting in this room live within, at very least, inside the culture of the modern Western world. We could get more specific, and we'd start seeing people's stories kind of split out in different angles. And so that's really the exciting thing about having a community of Jesus followers that have different stories, that don't all look and sound the same, don't all believe necessarily even the same things or undersee the world the exact same way. That's the really encouraging thing, is that when we come together, we actually become aware of the water that we're swimming in, right? It's kind of a crude metaphor, but like, is a fish aware of, can the fish see the water, right, that it's swimming through? No, it just becomes used to it because that's where it's always been. It's not aware of its surroundings. And so I'm curious for us, as we begin to look into the scriptures today and we begin to look at the world of Jesus, I think there's some really powerful ways that the scriptures even speaks to this very question. How do we know? How do we know truth? How do we know that whether or not, how can we measure ourselves against the past and understand and perhaps even see the own water of our own surroundings in that sense? So that's where I'd like for us to get into today, and we're going to be in the book of Matthew. If you got your Bibles with you, pull it out. We're going to read a little. Vamos a leer en el libro de Mateo esta mañana. And one of the before we get started, I kind of just want to give us a brief kind of overview of the culture, the history, and the time place that we find the writings of Matthew and Jesus, the life of Jesus. We're talking about reconstructing Jesus. So in order to do that, I think we really need to kind of deconstruct the environment, get down to the environment and the place, and ultimately, I think, deconstruct discipleship and our understanding of discipleship in the ancient Jewish context. And so I understand that as we do this, I am a 30-year-old white American modern person sitting up here and talking about not my own culture, but about a culture that existed halfway around the world, another time in an ancient context. So not just modern Jewish culture, but this is Jewish culture from 2,000 years ago. So take whatever I say with a grain of salt, okay? And I would encourage you to do your own research and looking and think about and grapple with some of these things. There's a lot of nuances, just like the world we live in today. There's a lot of nuances. We can make broad generalities, but those generalities can be helpful to a point, but then they're also can be very unhelpful to a point. So we're going to talk about it, get into it, and my hope is that maybe our eyes are open. We're not going to get everything and understand everything, but my hope is that our eyes are opened to the world of Jesus and to some of the factors that are at play. So thinking about that in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah talks about the coming Messiah, who we interpret as Jesus of Nazareth, but he talks about him, and one of the passages in Isaiah, he talks about Jesus as being a root or a shoot, a small plant, a green plant coming out of dry ground. Okay? Have you ever seen really, really dry ground before? We can tend to get, this past year we had a bit of a drought, and I'm sure some of the dirt here in Columbia and the surrounding areas starts to look a little bit, after there's not much rain, there's not much rainfall, not much water coming through, the ground starts to kind of divide, doesn't it? It gets these cracks in it, looks something like this. There's some really cool photos sometimes. I don't have any in here, but like if you look at like a desert, it's like dry most of the year. And like some places it's almost like uniform, the cracks, like they're so segmented and it's just like a pattern that goes like forever as far as your eye can see. Really cool photos that way. But this is what happens to ground that's dry. And this is what the prophets kind of describe the climate, the situation that the Messiah was going to show up in Israel. Now, I don't know if the prophet Isaiah was really trying to say this so much, but I just find it so interesting that Jesus is almost like a plant like this. If you go to the next slide, his life almost looks like this. The prophet chooses to describe him with his life looking this way. There's this dry ground where there's not much water, not much life. And yet, Jesus' life, the Messiah, was going to sprout up like a plant from within the cracks. And new life was about to appear in the midst of death. It's so funny that the ground actually looks like this, because I think in Israel, even the socio-religious and political environment of Israel at the time also resembled this ground. Very fractured, a lot of dividing lines. In fact, some of that is just normal for Jewish culture. There's a saying in ancient Judaism that where there's no debate, there's no learning, right? Sometimes some of us feel like our families are like this. Our goal is to learn by arguing, right? Yeah, like great plan. All the Enneagram 9 people were like, oh, right? So there's this environment where we actually learn by debating and testing ideas, right? Pushing them off of one another. And so within the Jewish world, there's these kind of different groups of people. And again, these are big generalities. And just like our current political climate, you can make generalities about left and right, and you can do all these things. But the reality is that many of us don't fit into little like comfortable boxes or on one end of a spectrum or in one segment. But many of us are a mix of things, right? There's a lot of nuance to the conversation. And so just to be clear, but we're going to go ahead and map out a few different things. So in ancient Judaism, there were a number of different groups and that were all kind of trying to speak to and answer one cultural conversation, one question happening in the ancient world, specifically in the land of Israel. We have many of these cultural conversations in our world today. Probably the closest thing might be just even the thought of, if you were to ask, like, what does it mean to be a healthy human being, right? In the modern world that we live in, Western world that we live in here in the United States, what does it mean for, maybe we'll just put our nation, what does it mean to be a healthy human? What does it mean to be a good person, right? What is the purpose of life? You know, where are we going, right? We talk about being progressive. Where are we going? What are the values that are going to shape how we get there? What drives how life should be lived? Is it just kind of you get to do whatever you want? Are there certain things that are good and certain things that are bad, right? There's this cultural conversation happening. It takes a lot of different forms. But in Israel, in ancient Israel, the big cultural conversation was connected to Israel's history, their story. See, Israel's story started out as a country of people that were called by God. All the nations of the world are worshiping a bunch of different gods, but the God who created everything, the God who is the God above all gods, was working to bring humanity back into sacred relationship with him, right? And so he chooses a people group and says, you're going to be, all these other gods and have their own nations, all these nations have their own gods, but you're going to be my people. And I'm going to establish this covenant, this relationship with you. It's based on a commitment, a faithful commitment to walk in tandem one with the other. We're going to walk in step. I'm going to show you how to do life. You're going to be my people. And as people see you walking, they're going to see my character. They're going to see what I'm like. They're going to see my love. They're going to see my desire, my end goal for the whole cosmos, right? And so Israel agrees to this. It happens on Mount Sinai after the Exodus, after God saves Israel. Israel agrees to this, but right when they're signing on the dotted line, they immediately go back into idol worship. And the whole story of Israel, from its conception and all the way through the time of Jesus, is this back and forth, like Israel trying to do the right thing and always doing the wrong thing. right? Trying to faithfully obey God and then always slipping back into idol worship and being like the nations around them. And the whole deal was, God said, if you will be faithful to this covenant promise, I will bless you. I will take care of you. Your life will go the way that I've planned it. It will be good, right? The whole book of Deuteronomy is kind of based on this idea. If you do the right thing and represent me, things will be good. But if you do the wrong thing, if you choose your own wisdom, if you choose to worship the gods that everyone else worships because that's just what's in vogue right now, if you do that, then things will not go well for you. In fact, you're choosing to walk in darkness. You're choosing to live life against the grain of the universe. This is not the way it was supposed to be. And so you're going to reap the repercussions, the consequences. It's going to be a curse to you. You'll be cursed. And so the cultural conversation happening in Israel at this time, again, there's a lot of things, but I think one of the easiest ways to understand it is the people of Israel are trying to figure out, what does covenant faithfulness look like in our time and space? Because at this point, Israel was not an autonomous nation, but they were occupied by a foreign global superpower. And while they had their temple, the place where they were supposed to worship, while they had that standing, they were limited in how they could worship God according to their own law. And so there was tension. They were being controlled, and sometimes I think the biggest image maybe the best representation of this kind of a climate for us that we could maybe even get close to identifying with might be like the way that the United States occupied like Iraq or Afghanistan or other nations like that, where we come in and we control basically what's happening in the country. The people have a degree of autonomy. They've got some form of government perhaps, but it is tightly controlled by the global superpower of the United States, right? To bring order or peace or whatever it is, right? So that's the same kind of dynamic going on here. And as we can see in places like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, places like that, there's certain people that are like, cool, like we'll buddy up and this will be great. And there's other people who are like, no, we don't want you here. Like we want you out. And the same dynamic is happening in Israel, obviously differences, but this is kind of the situation that they're living in. They're not exactly free to worship in the way that they want to, and there's always this talk of revolution and violent insurgency. So this is this climate, this fractured climate, and the question is, how do we remain faithful to God's covenant in this time and place? This is the cultural conversation. Every group, every fracture in Israel's culture and religion, and it was all connected, political, everything. Every fracture was kind of based on their interpretation of how they answered the question of, what does covenant faithfulness look like? And there's all these different opinions. So I think it's kind of helpful for me, and I'll try to make sure everyone can see this. I'm going to draw a little bit, so I apologize in advance. When we think about this question of covenant faithfulness, what does it look like to be faithful to God's covenant? It kind of is helpful, I think, to think about it like this. On like a graph. And I love, it's so crazy, the songs we were singing this morning. Deborah, I don't know where you're at, but the songs we were singing this morning totally, just it clarified so much of this for me, even as we were worshiping. If you think about covenant faithfulness, there was this kind of this dual dynamic thing going on with faithfulness to God's covenant. One would have been ritual purity, the people being ritually pure and able to interact with God in God's presence as his people. So this idea of clean hands kind of comes from this idea of ritual purity. In fact, that was a common symbol in the ancient world of the washing of hands, was an act of becoming ritually pure for priestly work, okay? So there's this idea of ritual purity, which I would put kind of down on this x-axis here. I'm just going to say ritual purity, okay? Or clean hands. And you may not be able to read this. I apologize for my handwriting in advance. My students at Heritage also can't read my handwriting, and it's always a laughing point for them. But ritual purity, clean hands. The other side of this would be humane spirit, was one way that scholars tend to put it, or compassion, or ultimately, I think it's really connected to the biblical idea of having a pure heart. In one of the Psalms, the psalm writer writes about God is that he led Israel like a flock of sheep. He led them with skillful hands, capable hands, and a pure heart. right? So these are two things. That one is connected to being ritually pure and having clean hands, doing the right things, justice. The other is connected to compassion, caring for people, and having a pure heart, right? Knowing what's most important to God, and your life and your heart is driven by the things that are most important to God. And so we can call this humane. You could call it humane, or I'm just going to put pure heart here because I think that's kind of the best. That's the way we were singing about it this morning. Was pure heart. Okay, so you got hands and heart. You've got this idea of justice and holiness, and then you've got this idea of purity and actually compassion and a care and a priority for human life. Right? I think that would be a good way of also thinking about this. Would be a high value of human life. Okay. There's a number of different groups. One of these groups would have been the Sadducees, and you'll read about the Sadducees in the scriptures. The Sadducees were this group of individuals who claimed descendancy from one of Israel's high priests in the time of Solomon, Zadok. They traced their lineage back to him, and they're predominantly a group of priests. And they were kind of the ones with the power and the money in Jerusalem. Okay, they ran the temple. They were kind of in charge. Many of them were in the Sanhedrin, the governing body of the Jewish people that ruled from the temple. And they're kind of located in Jerusalem, the capital city in Judea. They're the ones that are like, man, like they've got it going on. It's pretty good. They were also very interwebbed with the Roman government and received their authorization to be the high priest from the Roman government. And there was a lot of scandal and controversy over the legitimacy of that. Because many groups wanted to be in power in Jerusalem at that time. So the Sadducees, they were ironically being the priests. They were some of the ones that were known in that time more or less for being less concerned about ritual purity outside of the temple. So Israel is this culture inside of a bigger culture, right? It's like a subculture. And that's why this question of covenant faithfulness is so important, because the surrounding culture of Rome and the Greek culture around was actually becoming really difficult to resist as the Jewish people were losing their national identity and their way of doing life, their traditions, their lifestyles. And so that was why this question was so important. It was like, we're a subculture within this greater culture. How do we retain our tradition and our faithfulness to God in the midst of a culture that just wants to kind of like seduce us and pull us away, right? We can't identify with that at all, can we? Right? Okay, so that's why this conversation, there's such high stakes. And the Sadducees, ironically, they were the leaders of Jerusalem, but they were the ones that were in charge of the temple. But ironically, they were also the ones who, outside of the temple space, were the most Hellenistic or Greek-like. They had actually adopted many Greek customs and Greek culture, and it was kind of like the popular thing, right? They had the money, and so they kind of occupied this space where they weren't super concerned with ritual purity, and yeah, human life. I mean, they were kind of running Jerusalem like the mob a little bit. So their concern for human life was not super great. So they're not scoring well on our graph here. They're kind of somewhere in this. These are going to be really terrible drawings. I apologize. Somewhere in this space are the Sadducees, right? These are the ones who ultimately will be, who are kind of listed as the ones who actually put Jesus to death as far as ruling him condemned to be guilty. So you got the Sadducees here. You've got another group that kind of split out. They claimed the same descendancy, but they lost the kind of that fight for power in Jerusalem, and they were ousted. These were called the Essenes. They also tended to be a priestly group, but they decided, you know what, since we couldn't keep control in Jerusalem, all those priests are corrupt. They knew that the priests were running the temple like a mob, and they were doing it for money. And so they said, we're out of here. God's going to judge Israel. He's going to bring destruction against Israel. We're going out in the middle of the desert, and we're going to camp out there and wait for God to destroy Israel, and then he's going to put us in charge, right? Because we are the chosen ones. The teacher of righteousness is going to come, and he's going to make it all right, And so they're like, we're out of here, and we're going to focus on copying the Torah and the traditions of the elders. They took vows of poverty. They shared possessions, typically out there in the desert. Very kind of ascetic practices of fasting, and a lot of these things were kind of common in these communities. And actually, this community is one that the Dead Sea Scrolls come to us by a community that was most likely an Essenic community, and really, really fun if you want to look that up later. Really crazy stories there. So Sadducees, the Essenes, very high regard for ritual purity. They looked down on the Sadducees and they said, we want ritual purity. And also fairly, I'd say what we know, they did value human life in some respect. But they were a small kind of outcast group. So we're going to put them over here. The Essenes. Okay. Then you had this group that, and a number of groups actually, it wasn't just one group, but one of the common names that we hear this term used for is the Zealots. And this was a group that believed that it was actually according to the law, the way they interpreted the Torah was that it was morally wrong to pay taxes to Caesar, to the Roman government, because that was a way of honoring the Roman government as supreme. And so we do not worship the Roman government. We are only faithful to Yahweh. And so we refuse to pay taxes. But beyond that, beyond refusal, they actually organized violent resistance against the Roman government. So if you want to just think, again, in modern terms, this would be like an insurgency, a revolutionary group. Many terrorist groups operate this way, where we don't want you here. This is not right. And so we're going to make the world a better place by actually actively opposing you with violence and destroying you, right? So this is kind of what is happening here. I would say this, there was kind of a mixture. Some of them were concerned with ritual purity. Some groups, the Sakari men, the Fourth Philosophy, and some of these other groups were not really concerned with ritual purity or with the sanctity of human life in that sense. And even these groups would even fight each other, which is really kind of fascinating. But so this is kind of what's going on here. You got all these groups. I'm just going to put them down here. You've got Zealots, and you could say Sakari men. These guys would organize hits on Roman soldiers in public and really crazy stuff. So this is happening. And then you've got this other group. This is kind of the big group we're going to focus in on today. And this was the Pharisees. And I'm just going to draw it big like this because it was actually a fairly popular movement among the people. They get kind of a bad rap actually, let's do this. In the Bible, unfairly, because ironically, Jesus actually probably would have identified most with these people, at least the teachings and the representation of what he believed. This group was concerned about ritual purity, and depending on which school of thought within the Pharisaical tradition you were, some had a higher view of human life than others, or priority of human life. And there's a small group up here. If I get this cap to come off. There we go. There's a small group called the Hasidim. Okay? These men here were kind of a fringe group of the Pharisaical movement. The Pharisees were all about making the Torah, making the law relevant to people's everyday life. They said, everything that happens in the temple is important for the average person. So we're going to adopt what happens in the temple and see how can we implement this into our daily life to have covenant faithfulness before Yahweh. Not a bad thing. And actually much of what we do on a weekly basis, myself included, revolves around that idea of how can we take what's here, the truth, the wisdom, and how does it impact my regular life? How is it affecting my day-to-day? Now, Jesus had some strong words for them at moments, but also this group was also later one of the groups that actually would even support the Jesus movement. There was actually Pharisees who were members of the Jesus movement. So perhaps the way we talk about Pharisees, it might be nice for it to change and to become a little bit more introspective and say, hey, maybe this is a little bit closer to where we are, and maybe Jesus' harsh words for them should be evaluated as potentially, is there any value in those words for us? Jesus comes from this group, though. The Hasidim were kind of like a miracle. They were tended to be known as kind of miracle workers. They were this fringe group of the Pharisees who had a high view of human life. They valued the sanctity of human life and oftentimes prioritized human life over ritual purity, which would sometimes put them at odds with the rest of the Pharisees in many regards. These men were known to have greater intimacy with God. They actually referred to God in more of like an intimate father-son relationship, which was not common in the rest of Israel. They would often refer this having this close, intimate relationship with the Father. They were called men of deeds. Sometimes they were called men of righteousness. Mark Batterson writes about one of these characters in his book, The Circle Maker, if you've ever read that. Rabbi Ben-Honi, he talks about, he was one of these Hasidim, these teachers. They were typically craftsmen who were also highly studied in Torah. And they would have been trained by again, in this culture, they would have been trained by their fathers and their family in the Torah and memorized it from an early age, right? So these Hasidim had this kind of intimate relationship with God, and they were kind of on the fringe. They were known to be able to like work miracles, and they had like this special relationship with Yahweh. It was highly contested, and there was a lot of controversy around it. But there's actually a lot of evidence. Not a few number of scholars actually think that Joseph, Jesus' father, might have been one of these men. He's described in the Gospel of Matthew as being a righteous man, a man of tzedakah, a man of deeds, a man of righteousness. And it's very possible that much of Jesus's relationship, the way he talked about God being a father, was informed by what would have been a very normal Jewish tradition and education walking with Joseph. And he had this relationship. And so, again, this is not putting Jesus in a box, so to speak, but this is like, from the research that we have in the history, this is kind of this pocket that Jesus comes from. And this is where we come to in Matthew chapter 10. In Matthew chapter 10, it says this, summoning his 12 disciples. Again, disciples would have been students who would have learned under a rabbi. A rabbi was not like an ordained position, kind of like a pastor is of a church today. A rabbi would have been a term for like wise one or good teacher, someone who is generally accepted as having the authority to teach. So Jesus brings these 12 disciples around him and says, he gives them authority over unclean spirits to drive them out and to heal every disease and sickness. It gives the names. These are the names of the 12 apostles: Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Jesus pulls together a group of men who ironically come from every corner of this graph. Okay? Like, we got to think about the gravity of that, what that means. Jesus calls a guy who's called Simon, he's called a zealot. Right? He's a terrorist in some regard. I mean, he's an insurgent, right? There's some thought that maybe even Judas Iscariot, his name kind of sounds like one of the other groups, Sicarii men. He might have actually also been a part of a group like that. There's guys that were common like tradesmen who were just working. They hadn't made it. They didn't get to move into like teaching and becoming a rabbi. They actually just got kind of stuck at like, you're going to go learn a trade, School's not for you. And Jesus, unlike a typical rabbi, goes and finds these men who have been passed over by other rabbis, which is why they leave everything. It was common Jewish custom to, if you got chosen by a rabbi, you left everything and you dedicated your life to following him and walking in his footsteps. Not just learning his ideas, but learning his lifestyle. There's a phenomenal book, John Mark Comer writes, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And he talks about how, for us, it's very easy to talk about the ideas of Jesus, but no one really wants to talk about the way of Jesus. Jesus is a lifestyle, Jesus not just as ideas and truth. And so Jesus would have had these 12 disciples, these Talmudim, who would have followed him everywhere he went. And then says he sends out these 12 with these instructions. Don't go to the Gentiles, but go to the lost sheep of Israel and proclaim the kingdom of God, right? Heal the sick, raise the dead. He says, freely you receive, freely give. Don't acquire gold. Don't worry about clothes. Don't worry about what you're going to take with you. Just go simple, because a worker is worthy of his salary. And then he says, if people do not accept you in one place, he says, shake off the dust of your feet. It'll be more tolerable for that people group than it was for Sodom and Gomorrah, these two places that were destroyed in the Old Testament because of their wickedness. Well, then he goes on in verse 16, he says, look, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. Beware of them, because they will hand you over to the local courts and flog you in their synagogues. You will even be brought before governors and kings because of me, to bear witness to them and to the Gentiles. But when they hand you over, don't worry about what you are to speak. for you will be given what to say in that hour, because it isn't you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father is speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rise up against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the other. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple, a talmidim, is not above his teacher or a slave above his master. It is enough for a disciple to become like his teacher and a slave like his master. If they called the head of the house Beelzebub or Satan, how much more the members of his own household? But then he says this, therefore, so because of all this trouble coming your way, because of your testimony about who I am, therefore, don't be afraid of them. Since there is nothing covered that won't be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the light. What you hear in a whisper, proclaim it from the housetops. Don't fear those who kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. Rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them falls to the ground. Literally says, apart from your Father. You see that image? Aren't sparrows pretty worthless from human estimation? Don't humans regard sparrows as pretty much worthless? But not a single sparrow falls to the ground without your Father being right there. But even the very hairs of your head have all been counted. He's your Father. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Therefore, anyone who acknowledges me in heaven before my Father, I will acknowledge him, right? But if anyone denies me before my Father, if anyone says, no, I don't want to be associated with Jesus, then I will give him that. He's not associated with me. But don't think I came to bring peace on the earth. I came to bring a sword. For I came to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. And the one who loves a father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Anyone who finds his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. And the one who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Anyone who welcomes a prophet because he's a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And anyone who welcomes a righteous, there's that word again, righteous person, because he's a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, because he is my talmidim, truly I tell you, he will never lose his reward. He goes on and begins to talk to them in chapter 11. He says, referring to John the Baptist, who was the prophet who would go ahead of him. And he says, listen, who did you go out in the desert to see? Everyone that was going out to the desert to see John the Baptist and be baptized, this crazy stuff happening. Who did you go out to see? And he begins to talk to them. And he's like, you didn't go out to see like rich people. It wasn't like there was some kind of like, cool event going down out there in the desert. No, you went to see a prophet. Probably, most likely, many scholars think he might have been kind of connected to a community of Essenes, actually, right? But John's job was to prepare the way of the Messiah. And he says this in verse 10 of chapter 11. He says, see, John, this is the one it was written about. See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way before you. This is a direct quote from the prophet Malachi. And what Jesus does with it is brilliant, because he goes on and says, this is the guy who is the Elijah to come. And he takes 2 different chapters in Malachi and brings them together and says, this guy was the prophet who was going to come before Yahweh comes to judge. And he was supposed to prepare the hearts of the children and the fathers. He was supposed to mend generational relationships. He was going to come and get Israel ready for Israel's king. And John came, and they did to him what they wanted to. There was a remnant that repented and was baptized and believed and got ready, but the majority of Israel did not listen to John. In fact, the leaders of Israel put John to death. They put him in prison and kill him. And so Jesus says, just like it says in Malachi at the end, lest I come and strike the land with a curse. Because if I come and Israel's not ready, the land will be struck with a curse, the Deuteronomy curse. Jesus comes and he says, you didn't repent, you didn't get ready. And so now the coming of the Messiah will actually do the opposite. It will turn families apart. There will be division instead of unity. John was supposed to bring together the generations, and the people did not respond. And so now Jesus says, now it's going to be a sword. Because when truth makes enemies, not by picking fights. Truth makes enemies by virtue of its own existence. Like just by existing, truth makes enemies. Right? The truth doesn't need to pick a fight in order to have enemies. It just exists. And Jesus appears, and families now are divided. Goes on and says, what can I compare this generation? We just sang about that. Let us be a generation that seeks your face. Jesus says, what can I compare this generation? It's a generation, it's like two groups of kids in the market, and not a single one of them is listening to the other. One says, we played happy music for you. Why aren't you dancing? And the other said, well, we played sad music for you. Why aren't you crying? Right? No one's listening to each other. We've got this dry, cracked ground where everyone has their own opinion of what faithfulness looks like, and no one's listening. There's 7 groups and 17 opinions. No one's listening to one another. So Jesus gives these words, but then he comes to this incredible statement. In verse 25, Jesus says, I praise you, Father of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and revealed them to infants. You've hidden what covenant faithfulness looks like. You've hidden the kingdom from the wise and the intelligent, and you revealed them to little people. Yes, Father, because this was your good pleasure. All things have been entrusted to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except for the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son desires to reveal him. And Jesus says these words. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But Jesus, I thought you just got done saying that if we follow you, we're going to die. I just thought you said that because of you, we're going to be like hunted from town to town, and we're going to be persecuted, and everyone's going to hate us because of you. How is that, right? How is that restful? How is that a nice, and what does yoke mean, right? Just real quickly, I just want to throw can we throw those pictures of yokes up here? This is a yoke that goes on cattle, and it actually designed for oxen or whatever kind of animal you want to. I'm not any good with agriculture, but other animal that wants to put its head in there. You can pull heavy loads with these things. They're designed to be put on 2 animals. And in the ancient rabbis, in the Pharisee tradition, the teacher, when he would call followers, he would say, follow me, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. It was this idea of that their interpretation of covenant faithfulness was their yoke. Their teaching, their interpretation of the Torah was their yoke, and you would learn it, you would walk under it. And some rabbis were really, really strict. And they followed everything to the letter. You did all these things. You even did extra just to make sure you were being faithful to the covenant. And they would say, that rabbi's got a heavy yoke. That teacher is a hard teacher, heavy yoke. And Jesus, the Son of God, actually makes this statement. He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And this is where Jesus stands out from all of these teachers, because it's easy to look at this and go, man, Jesus isn't really inventing a whole lot of new. All his conversation about the kingdom of heaven came from the Pharisaic tradition. All of his language about like knowing the Father and loving the Father, a lot of it was already existent among the Hasidim in this community, right? All this language, even of storing up treasure in heaven, that didn't start with Jesus. It started with other teachers, and Jesus walks in and picks it up, right? And we start to go, oh my goodness, all this existed before Jesus. I thought Jesus was like he invented all of this, right? He didn't invent it. Well, beyond the fact that he actually invented humanity. But he came in and he taught to it. He came into a conversation that was already taking place, and he interpreted perfectly. And then he made this claim about himself. He says, Matthew 24, 25, he talks to, 23, Matthew 23, he talks to the Pharisees and he says, this is what you do. You Pharisees, you teachers, you take heavy loads and you put them on men's backs like a yoke, but you don't even lift a finger to help them. This is what makes Jesus different. The reason why Jesus' yoke is light, even with all this suffering and all of this, the reason why his yoke is light is because his yoke is different. He's actually talking about a conversation that's already taking place, and he comes into that conversation and says, listen, the yoke of covenant faithfulness is too heavy for Israel. This is the bad news. You cannot be faithful. You can't make God happy. You cannot earn God's delight or his grace. Grace is another word for delight. His favor. You can't earn it. Israel has tried and failed. They cannot earn God's delight. And Jesus comes and says, listen, unless your righteousness surpasses all of that, you'll never get it. But I am here. I am a new Israel. And I am covenantly faithful where you could not be faithful to the covenant. I am. And Jesus actually bears the dad yoke. Right? He bears the yoke of the Father and says, listen, he comes under it and says, Israel can't carry this, but I can. And Jesus, as Israel, his whole life walks in the footsteps of Israel, succeeding where they fail. And he himself is covenant, or is faithful to God's covenant, releasing Israel to stand up under the weight of that yoke. And he gives them a new yoke, and the yoke is this: follow. Follow me. Walk in my footsteps. This is the yoke of a disciple. It's not on you to carry the covenant anymore. It's on you to follow my footsteps. It's almost like walking next to someone who is, like if you ever carried something with someone who's taller than you, right? And the tall person is carrying, I know this because I'm not strong at all, but I know this because you end up carrying most of the weight. When I'm helping our little boy, he's just walking, he likes to pick things up, right? I help him pick things up. He's like, and I help pick him up, and he like holds on to it, right? And he's holding it. If you can imagine a bigger ox carrying a yoke, Jesus is carrying the yoke of faithfulness to God's law, faithfulness to the Torah. And his disciples, he says, the yoke I give you is easy and light. It's the yoke, what is it? To follow and become a little one. Anyone who even gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple will surely not lose his reward. Jesus lastly condemns the Pharisees. He criticizes them and says, listen, all of you decorate the tombs of the prophets, the graves of the prophets, and said, man, if we would have lived back in the times of our fathers, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. We wouldn't have killed God's messengers. And in reality, he says, you yourselves, by declaring that you are the sons of the ones who killed the prophets, incriminate yourselves. It's the water you're swimming in. You cannot be faithfully covenant to God. You decorate their tombs and say, we would have done better, when in all reality, you're not doing any better. You're going to put me to death. So he says, go ahead, fill up the measure of your father's sins, because you cannot do it. My question for us today is, what yoke are we carrying? What yoke are you walking under? Are you walking under the yoke of a political or religious ideology? Are you walking under the yoke of making someone happy? Jesus bore the weight of being worthy of God's delight so that we could bear the weight, much lighter weight, of being worthy of our calling. Paul says, strive to be worthy of the call. Don't strive to be worthy of God's delight, God's favor. That's been done. Strive to be worthy of the call. What's the call? Come follow. Come follow. Wherever you're at, I don't know where that is for you. I just would like for us to take a moment and pray. Jesus says, my yoke is easy, and it will involve suffering. It will involve pain. So man, when you're not trying to earn God's delight, when you're free to stand up under that, you can go through so much by the power of his Holy Spirit working within us to give us the ability to see hope on the other side. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I don't know where we're at in this place where some of us, we are burdened by many things, heavier yokes. We're carrying the weight of it. Some of us maybe in this room, like Jeremy shared earlier last week, that maybe we've thought that maybe the call of Jesus meant there was no work to be done, that there's no yoke, that we kind of get to do whatever we want. But I thank you that your word is true. And I ask that wherever we land on that spectrum, Jesus, I pray that we would turn over the impossible weight of the world, of carrying a yoke that's anything other than what you have given us, that we would turn over our lives to you, Jesus. We trust you. And God, if it means that we need to walk under your yoke and remember what that looks like, to walk in your steps, to follow you, to make our lives look like you, then I ask that we would be faithful to do so. We love you. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.